Good evening, everybody. My name is Alejandro Epifanio. I am the director of the Loisaida Inc. Arts and Culture Center. Thank you for joining us this evening. I am very glad you're here to hear the illustrated talk, Protest and Celebration by our dear friend Jane Weissman. Jane is an author, an historian, and a curator, and she has done extensive research as co-director of Artmakers Inc. on the different social-oriented murals from the 70s and 80s in the Lower East Side. So for us, it's truly an honor to have Jane back. She's a longtime collaborator of Loisaida Center, and I'm very pleased to have her basically illustrate to our audience all of her research into murals in the Lower East Side of the past 70s and 80s. I hope you enjoy it. Good evening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending my very first virtual talk. And thank you, Lower East Side, for inviting me to talk about the vibrant and provocative murals created in Lower East Side and the historic Lower East Side in the 1970s and 80s. Before beginning, I must give a grateful shout out to Alejandro, Paul, and Paloma walking me through the mechanics of presenting a virtual talk. So, to begin, Ivica Cross, the founder of Artmakers, my organization, was a self-described activist artist. And she famously said, "Painted images cannot stop wars or win the struggle for justice, but they are not irrelevant. They fortify and enrich the spirit of those who are committed to the struggle and help to educate those who are unaware." Political artist Mike Alowitz continued the thought, "When we make art in this studio, we assert our humanity. When we make art in public, we assert our existence as social beings." To understand the themes and content of community murals, we need to look at the larger social, historical, and political zeitgeist of the time in which they were painted. As you can see on the panel, the title of this talk is Protest and Celebration. The earliest murals are often called protest murals, but protest is a strange and interesting word. Protest. Pro meaning to call forth, and testare, which means to call to witness. So, existing within the word protest, which we usually equate with opposition, is the idea of affirmation. And as we shall see, even in the earliest murals, images of affirmation and celebration coexist along with those of protest and opposition, as well as resistance and accusation. Next slide. Pablo Neruda, the great Chilean poet and political activist who lived from 1904 to 1973, once said, "Murals are the people's blackboard." Mysterious to us, the images in prehistoric cave paintings were meaningful to the viewers. Early men and women knew that painted walls are an effective way to broadcast a message. People notice the murals around them. When I tell people I'm a community muralist, almost always they tell me about a mural that's in their neighborhood or they see on the way to work. They tell me when it was painted, what it meant to them, when it faded, and often enough, when it disappeared. I'm often amazed, too, how accurately they describe the imagery. Next, please. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, illiterate people learned the stories of the Bible through church frescoes and stained glass windows. Next, please. And starting in the 1920s, the murals of Los Tres Grandes Mexico's Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Jose Clemente Orozco both revived and created a non-colonial art and taught people their history. Next. In the United States, the murals of the WPA, Work Progress Administration, during the Depression of the 1930s, were painted in hospitals, schools, and post offices, most offering themes related to history and social issues. So, from the earliest time, the role of murals has been to beautify, protest, celebrate, educate, organize, and on occasion, inspire action. Next. Chicago's 1967 Wall of Respect is generally considered the first community mural in the United States and the start of a national community mural movement. Energizing America's urban landscapes, the murals immediately spread from Chicago to Detroit. And in the 1970s, they proliferated in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Albuquerque, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York City. The late 60s and 70s was a time of great political action. It was the winding down of the civil rights era, the culmination of protests against the Vietnam War, the renaissance of the women's movement with second wave feminism, the birth of the environmental movement, and the emergence of ethnic and racial pride. Next, please. The city's earliest community murals appeared in Harlem in the late 1960s. However, it was the prolific and high-quality production of City Arts Workshop in the 1970s, followed by the murals of Artmakers in the 1980s, that led to the Lower East Side being identified as the cradle of New York's community mural movement. But let's back up. What exactly is a community mural? First of all, community murals are collaborations between artists and neighborhood groups that have a particular message they want to convey. Residents play a significant role in determining themes and content, and artists develop the imagery that conveys the message. And we must never forget that while a mural is being painted, the artist's public dialogue can be as powerful as the mural itself. In this mural, it was a group of young Black men on the Lower East Side who living in a time of great crime and violence, wanted to express their fears. So they projected these scenarios and created these images that were painted on plywood panels and put up on a wall. So you can see lots of fights. You see the Black Power salute in honor of the Olympic athletes who raised their fists at the Mexico Olympics in 1968. And in the upper left-hand corner, we see the first instance of censorship of community murals. Those figures in red is basically a drug deal or a payoff. You can see what looks like the policeman's nightstick on the left. And it turns out that the Police Benevolent Association came down on City Arts and said, you've got to change it. And it did get changed, but not before this photo was taken for posterity. Next. It is this collaboration of mutual respect of everyone involved that distinguishes community murals from commission murals, memorial walls, and what can be termed as artist-initiated murals or street art, whether it's aerosol or paste-ups. Here, this is one of the first big murals. This building is 100 feet high, and 60 teens working for the first time on a scaffold again use that reverse projector technique to create a scenario that moves from left to right, from really bad stuff to a time of hope. So we're moving beyond drugs and violence and arson to something, a more positive future. And here we see a lot of images that recur again and again in community murals. We see chains, we see flames, which probably refer to the arson that existed in the Lower East Side. Uh, it was a great financial crisis, and landlords were torching their buildings for insurance. Also, in the middle, you see an ankh, the man holding his hand raised, and he's holding an ankh. Well, that ankh was first a cross. But the Jewish residents of the building directly across the street said, no, 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 no. We can't look out our windows and see a cross. So the cross was turned into an ankh. And that's the kind of dialogue that can exist. Next, please. And that dialogue led to a whole series of what are called ethnic murals. Here is the Jewish ethnic mural, the first in a series that expressed cultural identification and group solidarity. And basically, what happens is that murals reflect the mood and hopes of local residents. Murals also call attention to neighborhood concerns. They chronicle cooperative efforts to address problems and convey pride of communal accomplishment. They commemorate historic events, several of which are represented in this mural, and they honor local and national heroes. Next, please. Murals are often a window to an unofficial history of a neighborhood. What's depicted on the wall often provides a depth of understanding equal to and sometimes greater than what's in the official records. Filling this mural are historical scenes of miners, railroad workers, a sweatshop, and a musician that surrounds four large faces that was supposed to represent a Chinese family. But the face of the large figure looked an awful lot like Mao. And as this was a time where loyalties were divided between Taiwan and mainland China, it created a lot of conversation and confusion. Adding to that confusion are two real life billboards on either side of that family. But even more confusing is the commission mural at the top of the wall. That face is that of the building owner, who too looked a lot like Mao. So people were really confused, especially when you could look and you see the signs, "You have a friend in Chinatown." Next, please. This mural shows a Chinatown stripped of cliches. There's an elderly gentleman off to the right, and he stands in contrast to such negative aspects as a prostitute, a deck of cards floating over a dead man, and a bunch of gawking tourists. The two people walking down the street is a very sly allusion to the young people of Chinatown. Gang activity was pretty rife at this time, but yet the artist did not want to portray it in any real way. Next, please. Next slide. Can we get to the next slide, please? Good, thank you. Those of us who love Italian Renaissance painting take great pleasure in this mural's reference to an altarpiece and the small predella panels that are usually running across it. You see these beautiful Renaissance bodies, as well as the Brooklyn Bridge in the far right panel. Next, please. And here we have images of historic Spanish conquistadors and runaway slaves at the bottom of the wall. And then the images lead up to scenes of contemporary Puerto Rican life in New York City. You will note that there's an asterisk next to the title, Puerto Rican Heritage Mural. When I put together this talk, an asterisk meant that the mural still existed. At the time, the Jewish Heritage Mural also existed. Unfortunately, don't even let me get started. That mural was torn down for some ill-favored housing project a few years ago. Most of the murals that are discussed in this talk are long gone. While some murals last for decades, others disappear within a few years. They are vulnerable to weather, sun, wind, rain, wall spring leaks, and require repairs that cover or destroy them. Buildings come down, buildings go up, also destroying or covering murals. And sometimes murals are lost due to conflicts and controversy. While we might physically lose the murals, it's imperative we do not lose their memory. Thus, I'm so glad to have a chance to present this talk. Next, please. Mural themes are often reflected in mural titles, and despite the passage of time, many of the murals they address are woefully still with us, as here, the lack of decent and affordable housing, gentrification, homelessness, slum landlords, and the failure of government to adequately address them. You can see the dollar sign, you can see lightning, again, symbols that will recur in murals time and time again. Murals also address the need for social justice and for better education and healthcare, and alas, the critical need for improved community police relations. Next, please. This is the earliest and for many years the only New York City mural to question the government's lack of enlightened environmental policies. Next, please. Another environmental mural. Next, please. This is one of the most interesting murals. It was the first time that a mural was painted north of Houston, going into Lower East Side proper. Up till now, the murals have been in the historic Lower East Side. This truly was a coalition of African and Latino gangs. In fact, the 7 spears in the middle of the mural represent each of the gangs who came together and agreed on the imagery. On the right, we have historic Puerto Rican figures. On the left, we have African cultural figures. And then you have things like the drums, which are going to appear in both cultures. Next, please. Here, the Statue of Liberty creates a powerful statement of possibility and accomplishment. Her face may be entwined in chains, but the staircase spiraling up her arm offers advancement and opportunity. The flames here are not of destruction, but of purification. We have hands clasped and fists raised, not in protest, but in celebration. Next, please. Shown in cross-section are 3 floors of a tenement building in an area of the Lower East Side where the 3 languages of the title are spoken: Chinese, Spanish, and English. In the mural, images of oppression fill the bottom. On the left, fat rat developers, note the tail, push against the building, impeding construction of decent housing. On the right, a mother hands over the rent to the slumlord, whose arm morphs into the tentacle of a grasping octopus, an image that, too, appears again and again. At the top, people's arms are clasped, hands are raised in community accomplishment. Next, please. I think I have a phone call coming in. Let's decline that. Okay. There we go. Great. At the bottom of this mural, 4 tall figures support an unfurling Puerto Rican flag, which organizes depiction of urban life and factory and farm workers. At the top, 3 triumphant figures and demonstrators carry placards with the mural's title, Work, Education, and Struggle, the Seeds of Progressive Change. There are portraits of the Puerto Rican independence heroine, Lolita Lebron, Angela Davis, Malcolm X, and Ho Chi Minh, whose presence was vigorously protested by the 2 Vietnam veterans who owned the adjacent parking lot. Twice, white paint bombs obliterated Ho's face, and you can still see a white blob kind of where that yellow field off on the right meets the red ribbon. That pink bomb was lobbed after the scaffold came down. Couldn't do much about it at that point. Next, please. This mural presents scenes of Chinese history and contemporary life. And that wonderful dragon organizes all the different aspects of Chinatown today or then. Okay, next, please. In 1967, even before the Harlem and City Arts Workshop murals, a group of artists in the East Village in Brooklyn began producing large murals to, quote, relieve the drab monotony of the city's gray spaces. Basically, the artists produced the designs in their studio. There was no community input, and sign painting companies fabricated them. The group was called City Walls, and its aesthetics and philosophy were diametrically opposed to that of community muralists. Ivica Cross stated that these walls served, quote, as a cosmetic function at best, seen by local residents as cultural imperialism. And art critic John Canady compared them to piped music and elevators. Both camps had its supporters and detractors. Community murals were usually declared to be too social realist. A few city walls that still exist today. Frankly, they've held up well. Next, please. Please. 2 more city walls. Next, please. Okay, this one by Knox Martin called Venus was restored, but then a Frank Gehry building went up just in front of it. So now you can only see a little bit of it. Next, please. Another Knox Martin, and then Tanya. Tanya, you can still see on the corner of 3rd Street and Mercer, I think, down in the village near the Angelica Theater. Next, please. Aha, okay. So what we've mostly seen of city walls were abstract works, but perhaps abstract 112 Prince Street. First-time viewers like me often experience a eureka moment when realizing that the cast iron wall of the building's eastern face is really a continuation of the actual street facade. Today, the mural is very faded, degraded, and covered with tags. It's very sad to see. Thank you. Oh, not thank you. Next, please. This is one of two walls that make up Ballet Bamba. This gorgeous woman dancing in Puerto Rico. And the next wall, next, please. Shows images of New York City contrasted with Puerto Rican life. You can see the Gigante mask over on the right. Next, please. Look at how the mural's design takes clever advantage of the boarded up building's architecture. It fills the window niches on the second floor, and that trumpet player looks like he's about to dance down that flight of stairs. Next, please. This mural portrayed local denizens and views of the city through faux holes in real brick walls. The former mayor are depicted as panhandlers. Men who paint murals really love our paint splattered overalls. We take great care of sneakers. And he's painting one day, and this Japanese tourist comes up, points to them, and says, "How much?" Taken aback, Jeff says, "How much you got?" The guy looks in his wallet, says $80. And Jeff said, "I'll take it." It basically paid his rent for that month. Next, please. In 1982, Keith Haring created a mural for this wall. For years, it had been a magnet of tags, and this mural lasted several seasons. Then in 2008, after years of more tagging, the building owner, Goldman Properties, turned the wall into a revolving showcase for the best known of the world's street artists. And at the top, we see a recreation of Keith's 1982 mural, recreated in 2008. Next, please. What's interesting about Logan Hicks' story of my life at the bottom is that it represents real people of the Soho neighborhood. And somewhere in there, it's hard for me to see on my little cell phone, is Martha Cooper, the great street photographer who has been documenting street art for the past 30 years, maybe. Shout out to Marty. Next, please. In this mural, visiting Chicago artist John Weber included lines of poetry written in Spanish and English, as well as citizenship papers reflecting the cultural heritage of the Afro-Caribbean gardeners. Next, please. The three larger-than-life figures in La Plaza Cultural mural represent the descendants of African slave, Chinese, and Latino immigrants. Ingeniously incorporated into the figures are ships and trains, symbolizing their journeys and history to and in the New World, as well as cultural icons of the lands left behind. The need to waterproof the wall doomed the mural. Next, please. However, in summer of 1985, this mural, La Lucha Continua, The Struggle Continues, replaced Freddie's mural that we have just seen. And here we can see a large collective mural. 14 people worked on it, and 6 of the project's 26 smaller individual murals. And we're going to come back to La Lucha Continua. Next, please. Again, the wall surface was problematic, and after a few years, the La Lucha wall was covered with tar. In 2015, new owners renovated the building and commissioned this mural designed with no community input. Next, please. Here we see Ivica Cross with another founder of Artmakers, Camille Perrotet, who is now its artistic director, looking over plans. La Lucha brought together 34 artists whose murals address 6 themes of importance to the people of Lower East Side. They included gentrification, police brutality, women's issues, immigration, and protests against U.S. interference in Central America and apartheid in South Africa. Those issues are still with us in terms of the protest of U.S. interference. We can just talk about the Near East instead of Central America, and we don't have to go to South Africa for apartheid. It exists right here in the United States. At the bottom is the dedication celebration of La Lucha Continua. Next, please. This map shows the placement of the murals on the walls of the 4 mostly vacant buildings surrounding La Plaza Cultural Community Garden, then largely abandoned as it had been taken over by drug dealers. The murals brought back the community, and again, the garden flourished. Next, please. La Lucha Continua, The Struggle Continues, is a portrait of a neighborhood. All the bad stuff that can happen is on the left. The wrecking ball, people being evicted, homelessness. At the bottom of the globe, we see that octopus again and people protesting. The globe represents the future, what could be. And then on the right, you have the good things that can happen in the neighborhood. You have sweat equity. You have a windmill representing environmental progress. You have good food available and at good prices. What I wanted to tell you that in 2017, Artmakers mounted a commemorative exhibition about the 26 murals. And a discussion of them really requires its own slide talk. So, 2 things. For fuller descriptions, please visit the website, laluchaartmakers.org, LALUCHA artmakers.org. And I'm going to be very brief in going through the murals because we need to get through this talk. Okay. Next, please. Keith's metaphor for positive change is a root, the root of community and social activism. Camille, who, as I said, is now Artmakers' artistic director, wanted to express the joyful feelings of being an artist and a young mother, and to convey these positive feelings to Lower East Side youth. The words liberty, equality, solidarity are expressed in French, Spanish, Basque, and English. Next, please. The meaning of the stop sign on the dog cage in front of the wall is made abundantly clear by the two oversized hands trying to halt development, symbolized by the wrecking ball that threatens the lives of the children playing in the neighborhood. Next, please. Here again is the octopus representing corporate greed and government policies that favor the rich. And on the right, we see one of the many fallouts of gentrification was and remains the displacement of longtime neighborhood residents. So here is a protest against that. Next, please. Michael Stewart, shown at the bottom, was a street artist who, late one night in 1983, was beaten by transit cops in the First Avenue subway on 14th Street. He died 13 days later without regaining consciousness. Chico's mural at the top left, it's interesting because you see here that the cops are holding nightsticks, and that's actually what they used to beat Michael. But in an earlier version, the cops are holding guns, which was not true. And at the right, we really have a comic book panel, which shows the bar where Michael worked, him flirting with a girl, going into the subway, drawing his tag, the transit cops beating him, and his death at the hospital. And that kind of funny looking figure in the rear is Mayor Koch looking on. Next, please. On the left, the mural was actually inspired by a real incident at a housing rally down at City Hall. A young man was basically protesting the cop on the horse. Note how the angle of the horse's head suggests a gun, loaded, aimed, and ready to be fired. On the right, the mural honors activists fighting for civil rights and against apartheid in South Africa. Next, please. On the left is a tribute to South African women, mothers, students, and workers, and their role in the anti-apartheid struggle. Most of the signage comes from actual photographs of demonstrations. On the right is a mural that Cliff said was not just about apartheid, but the struggle in all Africa against the legacy of imperialism and the more recent corruption of neo-imperialism. It's really hard to see the colors are that of the ANC flag. The red represents blood. The black is what is the black? Oh dear. But at the bottom, the green, you have these beautiful silhouettes of figures that are just walking across the landscape with little flowers peeking up. Sorry about that. Next, please. On the left, Sueño expressed the artist's concern that Puerto Rican culture and its arts were being replaced by North American pop culture. So again, we see the Gigante mask. There's a bladder that's filled with beans, and the people who wear the mask go through these festivals making fun of people. And then on the right, this ceramic piece was inspired by pre-Columbian ruins of Mexico and Central America, and it honors the vitality and dignity of the people against repeated invasions. Next, please. The title expresses the aim of the mural for the women of South Africa, Central America, and the Lower East Side. Oops, I went too far. Sorry. This mural by Karen Batten addresses U.S. involvement in Nicaragua, one of four Central American countries, the others being Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, where U.S. sponsored funding and interventions led to disastrous results. We see farming, we see education, we see helicopters hovering in the sky. Next, please. Okay, here we see the grace and strength of these women from South Africa, Central America, and the Lower East Side, who's hanging out her laundry at the bottom right. The figure on the left is actually Ricky, the artist, who was painting herself painting. And this is one of two La Lucha murals that still exists. On the lower right, you can see a ghost of the image. It's on the 9th Street building just adjacent to the garden. Next, please. And here we see Latin Americans standing strong against the clandestine actions and damaging policies of the United States. Despite the constant threat of death, these people continue to live their lives, represented by images of peace, nature, art, dance, and music. And at the bottom right, you can see the ghost of that image too. Both these murals are on the same building wall, although separated maybe about 50 feet. Next, please. On the left, this scene of Sandinista soldiers sitting around a campfire at night, easing their struggles with a cooked meal, conversation, and some music, was inspired by stories told by the artist's cousin who fought alongside with Che Guevara. On the right, the mural honors the activism of San Salvadoran women who, during the country's long civil war, waited for their missing sons to come home, holding out hope for hours or days before accepting the fact that they were probably dead. And in the middle of that wonderful multicolored background, you see this black trench of a grave. Next, please. The mural on the left represents the Disappeared of Guatemala. The mural shows a map of Central America with Guatemala rendered in ceramic. Framing the indigenous woman at its center and below are names of hundreds of people who disappeared at the hands of the state and the police. On the right, the mural shows an unlucky border crosser who was stopped and led away by border agents, while his family, dependent upon his earnings, nervously awaits news. Today, that family might be law-abiding residents in the U.S. facing the threat of deportation. Next, please. In the top part of the mural, Robin shows famous activists and community members sitting in judgment of the global war makers below. The 6 top row jurors are leaders from Central America and South Africa. The bottom row are people from the community. Kristen's repeated figures of the armed stealers are set against a field of color. Their missiles and guns litter the ground. Next, please. A year or so later, Kristen and Robin teamed up again, here fusing their very separate styles that we just saw to create the experience of a Puerto Rican neighborhood and the ambivalence the community felt between the economic necessity of being in New York and the memory of their beautiful island. Robin described the arched niches as, quote, sort of Italianate, filtered through Latin America. Next, please. Maria Dominguez, another La Lucha alumna, directed the 6-mural cluster at El Bohío, the community center run by Charis, which partnered with Artmakers to make the creation of La Lucha Continua possible. And you can see the building is now closed. It's been, don't even get me started. But it really should be a community center, but there's a guy who wants to develop it, and it's a mess. The bottom shows the niches in which the 6 murals were placed. And the next slide, please, is by Eva. And you can see her painting this older woman who's based on the painting by Miguel Becerra, a 19th century Puerto Rican artist, quite well known. And but instead of holding the icon, inside the wrapped image is the farmer in the Farid painting. Now, all of these murals spoke to the Lower East Side mural experience and were painted in the artist's individual styles. We're going to just run through the others because I don't know much about them. So next, please. By Roland Vega. Next, please. By Pedro Tirado Vidal. Next, please. Artist unknown, but it's called Paz. Next, please. This is murals. This is Maria's beautiful mural of the Lower East Side Festival. You can see the dancer and then the guy with the bladder that goes around making fun of everybody. Next, please, El Actad. And then a couple of years later, 6 La Lucha alumna were among the 19 artists who created, next please, who created the collective brush and ceramic murals, as well as 9 individual pieces that made up the changing face of Soho. And this was in the Broadway Lafayette subway station. And it's scenes of the neighborhood as they were, as they had been. And next, please, is the ceramic mural. Next, please. And we're closing towards the end here. The Pathfinder mural was painted, was inspired by La Lucha. La Lucha was 34 artists working on 26 panels. Here we have one humongous mural painted by 80 artists who came from 20 countries. And the mural celebrated revolutionary struggles in Cuba, Grenada, Nicaragua, and South Africa, as well as local international uprisings of the exploited working classes. The central image is a large red printing press. The pages issuing forth are portraits of working class and revolutionary leaders whose works were published by Pathfinder Press, which had its operations in the building for many years. The building is now gone. It's replaced by one of the 3 Richard Meyer glass towers on the West Side Highway. Pat Buchanan, the conservative columnist, called this mural, quote, a 6-story shrine to communism, a Marxist Mount Rushmore in Greenwich Village. There's lots to say about this mural, but I will leave it that it was controversial. Next, please. Pathfinder was inspired by La Lucha and it in turn inspired art makers when women pursue justice in Bed-Stuy. This mural honors 90 activists who, risking life and liberty, fought for social change in the United States. Viewed as a large demonstration, its central image is Shirley Chisholm on a golden steed. She is surrounded by portraits of 14 movement leaders on placards and smaller portraits of 67 activists, including the 9 ancestors in the upper left corner, basically surrounding Dorothy Day, who ushered in and made possible 20th century activism. This mural, too, demands its own talk. Next, please. Ivica Cross moved to Los Angeles in 1989 and died in 1999 from breast cancer. This mural commemorates her life and the wide influence she wielded on scores of community muralists. There's a picture of Eva, bottom left, on a scaffold, working on the globe in La Lucha. And on the right is a reference to La Lucha and the 2 beautiful construction workers. Next, please. The Chico Mendes Mural Garden was named for the Brazilian grassroots leader murdered for his efforts to protect the Amazon rainforest. He is honored in Ron English's memorial mural at the top left. The garden is gone, replaced by housing. However, next mural, please. She's Packing on the left was saved by the Visual Artists' Rights Act because it was part of a city-sponsored program, the Artists for Smoking Prevention program, sponsored by the Department of Health and the Mayor's office. Here we see a pregnant woman and her fetus, both smoking. And what happened was the housing was actually pushed back from the sidewalk enough feet, so not only is She's Packing still visible, but also a good portion of Chico's In Memory of Anthony. Next, please. Here's another anti-smoking mural, this one on East 4th Street, just east of the Bowery. Next, please. This beautiful 9/11 mural was painted on a Cooper Union-owned building after one tragedy, 9/11. Here, New York City's iconic buildings, studded with thousands of tiny windows, are set a deep blue sky. The Twin Towers are filled with flowers, echoing the mounds of blooms laid in front of firehouses and in parks. The tragedy we're now living through has already inspired equally moving murals dedicated to COVID-19's first responders and essential workers. Let's hope we all get through this safely and quickly. Next, please. To learn more about New York City's community murals, you can't beat this cultural history, co-authored by Janet Braun-Reinitz and me. It's available from the Lower East Side Center. And to learn how to get it, you can write info@lowereastsaida.org. LOISAIDA. info@lowereastsaida.org. Next, please. And to learn more about the 2017 La Lucha Continua exhibition hosted by the Lower East Side Center, visit laluchaartmakers.org. LALUCHA and then Artmakers. So there are 2 A's in the middle. And the exhibition catalog is also for sale. Thank you so much. I think you've been a great audience. I can see all of you out there. While we are live, those of you on Facebook and YouTube, if you have questions, you can send them in on chat and I'll try to answer them. And then anybody watching this after tonight, feel free to write me at artmakersnyc@aol.com. Okay. Thank you so much and have a great evening, a great weekend. Be safe and stay well.